Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the launch of the 2024 Critical Trends Report, which WEDO has put together with a growing cohort of amazing feminist colleagues and friends. We are going to give it just 1 or 2 more minutes before we start. So thank you for your patience. But in the meantime, we'd love to know who's with us. So if you'd like, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. You can share your name, your organization if you have one, and where you're calling in from today. Thanks so much. Thanks so much to everyone who's just joined. We're just giving it 1 more minute as I see a lot of people still coming in, and then we'll get started. As we're getting set up, a note that we do have interpretation today in Spanish, French, and Arabic. So please activate the interpretation if you'd like to listen in another language. If you're looking for Arabic, it's under Japanese, because the version of Zoom that I have does not offer Arabic as an option. So apologies for that. Okay, I think let's get started. Thanks so much to those who are introducing themselves in the chat. Please do feel free to continue doing that for those who have just joined. So my name is Katie Tobin. I'm a senior program manager at WEDO, the Women's Environment and Development Organization. We're a feminist advocacy organization working on primarily climate, but also recently economic justice as well, out of our conviction that systemic change requires a holistic and intersectional approach. And we are super excited and honored, honestly, to be launching the second annual edition of what we're calling our Feminist Critical Trends Report, which started as the sort of flagship product of the Feminist Action Nexus for Economic and Climate Justice, which some of you may remember as an initiative that still exists with a listserv and with this report, but was mainly more active a few years ago as kind of a co-created space for structural feminist knowledge sharing and collective advocacy at the intersection of gender, economic, and climate justice. So we have an exciting agenda for today, which I'll go over in a minute, but maybe just to share, first of all, one more time that we are very happy to have interpretation today. So we have Spanish, French, and Arabic simultaneous interpretation. So I think the instructions are in the chat. I think in this Zoom era, most of us are familiar with how to activate the interpretation, but if you need a refresher, please have a look in the chat. And if you have any problems with the interpretation, please indicate that in the chat as well. And my colleague, Claudia Rubio, and I will do our best to get it sorted out. So again, we have Spanish, French, and Arabic. And if you're looking for Arabic, please choose Japanese as your language on Zoom. And apologies for that. We also have Kenya Sign Language interpretation. If you'd like to follow with Kenya Sign Language, you can spotlight Penina Vulimu. You'll see her on the participants list. So yes, so this week is the third subcom of the Financing for Development negotiations process for the 4th Conference on Financing for Development, which will be held later this year. Last week, we had the first organizational session for 2025 of the negotiations towards the UN Tax Convention. So there's a lot happening in terms of these multilateral spaces that we're following, while at the same time, we're very much aware that the context for what we would want to see in terms of feminist systemic change, which we've outlined through previous work of the Feminist Action Nexus into what we called our 7 key demands. So those are around overarching systems change and transformation, tax justice, debt justice, trade, global economic governance, so reforming around democratic systems, the Bretton Woods Institutions in particular, ending corporate capture of our spaces, and then gender responsive / eventually gender transformative climate finance. And we know that the context for these demands is, to put it bluntly, is only getting worse. This trends report project really came up as a way to create a baseline of where are we against those 7 key demands? How far are we from the kind of world we'd want to see? And then to update it every year with where we have, backsliding and hopefully eventually some progress, as well as spotlighting the local sites of struggle where we know that people's movements and feminist groups are highlighting alternatives, are showing that it is possible to do things differently. But it's no surprise to anyone that we're in a really challenging context for multilateralism, for human rights, the sort of obviously election and coming into power of Donald Trump and others like him all over the world that both pre-existed this particular moment in US politics, but also are emboldened by it. Obviously continued militarization, the continued threats to the sovereignty of Palestinian people, despite a fragile and temporary ceasefire, the continued capitalist glorification of profit and growth over people's well-being. And then, of course, the deeply disappointing and insufficient climate finance agreement that was reached in Baku just a couple of months ago. So the collective fight for feminist economic and climate justice has never been more urgent. And that's really the context into which we're trying to intervene with this project, to kind of help all of us have an evidence-based kind of grounding in facts and statistics and analysis that we can use for our collective advocacy. And we see that as a contribution that we're trying to make to this broader movement. So today, we're going to hear from Arimbi Wahono. Arimbi is a senior consultant at Shared Planet, who has written this year's update as well as the original 2023 trends report, and we hope will continue to write the annual trends report. We have a really wonderful working relationship with Arimbi and with Shared Planet, and Arimbi will go over the report and share the main highlights where things are in terms of debt, tax, global economic governance, and climate finance, which are the 4 areas we focused on this year. And then we're really excited to have a wonderful group of feminist respondents, Julia Gerlo from FARN, which is an environmental justice organization in Argentina, Naomi Nyamweya from the Malala Fund, who's going to talk to us about debt and its impact on girls' education with a new initiative that Malala Fund is running. And then Shereen Talaat from MENAFem movement for economic development and ecological justice, who's going to talk to us about how this relates to MENA feminist organizing around financing for development and where we think we should go next. And then we should have a good half an hour for hearing from you, your reactions, whether you think the report, the extent to which it speaks to your experiences, if you have ideas on how to use it, or anything else in terms of our kind of collective struggle against the prevailing winds in our context. So hopefully that sounds like an okay plan. And I'm really happy to be joined by Arimbi and to be handing over to Arimbi now to share with us the report. So Arimbi, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Katie. So I'm Arimbi, a senior consultant at Shared Planet, and we're a research consultancy that focuses on social and environmental justice. So as Katie noted, it's been a really incredible partnership, both with Katie and WEDO, but also with a very brilliant set of feminists that was able to review this work and contribute their expertise. And I'm very excited to be hearing from all of them and really cannot thank them enough for all their contributions. So without further ado, I will launch into the presentation. So if we go to the next slide, perfect. I wanted to start out by talking about the kind of broader context that we see this trends report sitting in. And first is the 2023 UN Global Stocktake, which determines that we are extremely off track in keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. And not just that, but the window of opportunity to act is narrowing. And we see it as extremely urgent to be pointing a finger at the climate criminals that are responsible for this, which is, of course, the wealthiest countries and individuals that are setting the world on fire to be lining their pockets. But it's also other things like the record highs in defense budgets that are fueling the climate emergency, diverting funds away from economic and climate justice. And as Katie has rightly pointed out, this is nowhere more evident than in the ongoing Israeli genocide of Palestinians that's backed by substantial US financial and military aid. And as feminists, we recognize that women, girls, and gender diverse people are bearing the absolute worst consequences of all of these conditions. And under austerity and militarization and financialization, women are most likely to lose their access to essential public services, face increased losses of livelihood, increase their provision of care work to sustain their communities, and just in general have much less ability to be adapting to ecological destruction. And so our structural feminist analysis is grounded in understanding how gender inequality is informed and reinforced is what I meant to say, by political systems and macroeconomic phenomenon, as evidenced in the areas of the 4 chapters that cover this report, which are debt, taxation, the IMF and World Bank, and climate finance. And so even though we cover these trends in 4 separate chapters, we think that it's really important to highlight how interconnected the trends in all 4 areas are. And so on the next slide, we made this infographic for the introduction of the report. Perfect. To highlight those interconnections, and I'll be noting just a few as examples. So for example, linking debt and taxation, we can see that the money that's lost through tax evasion and lack of progressive taxation can drive countries into greater debt to finance their spending. And then in turn, greater debt drives increases in regressive taxation to raise the money for debt servicing. And we see that evidence overwhelmingly shows that women are disproportionately impacted by the regressive taxation because of the loss of consumption spend that results from that. Higher debt burdens can also increase countries' reliance on IMF loans, which in turn leads to the imposition of IMF-mandated austerity and penalization. So that's just some of the links. I can't cover all of them in the 15-minute presentation, but we hope that you check out the report to maybe have a more comprehensive look at this. And so I'm going to dive right into presenting some of the key trends that we see across the 4 chapters, where we also want to highlight kind of what we as feminists want to see from a systems change perspective and the progress that might have been made towards those changes. So starting out on the next slide with our chapter on debt. So I'm just waiting for, perfect, okay. What we see is that debt service payments are increasing and approaching all-time highs for the most climate vulnerable countries, which we see on this infographic on the next slide, which shows that these countries are already some of the most critically indebted in the world. And that makes them even more vulnerable to climate change because instead of spending money on climate mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage, they have to spend money on servicing their worsening debt. And making matters worse, what we see is that much of this debt isn't just going towards repayments. It's actually enriching the private lenders who drag out negotiations to maximize their profits. And so we have a few examples of this in the report. Suriname is one. Private creditors canceled just over $250 million in debt, which was already minimal even by IMF standards, but only in the condition that they get back 3 times that amount from future oil revenues. And so what we see is that that's locking a climate vulnerable country into even further cycles of extraction. And this is really not an isolated case. Our report highlights similarly outrageous deals that were made throughout 2024. So on the next slide, please, Katie. Thank you. Including in Zambia and Sri Lanka, we see that, so this is the kind of case study box that we have in the report that demonstrates what we call local sites of struggle. Zambia's restructuring under the G20 Common Framework has forced them to pay $450 million to private bondholders, and that includes mostly BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, which has previously refused to suspend debt payments to Zambia, even during the height of COVID-19. Debt repayments, sorry. And in Sri Lanka, a July 2024 deal also forced them to pay private bondholders 46% more than government lenders if their economy improves. but there's no kind of equivalent protection for if the economy takes a turn for the worse. So just to highlight what we would like to see as feminists is a multilateral debt workout mechanism under the auspices of the UN, which has been advocated by the G77 plus China bloc of developing countries, but largely instead, mainstream creditors have been advancing kind of piecemeal and colonial solutions that prioritize private payouts over true debt cancellation and reparations. And just to illustrate quickly with one example of that kind of false solution is the use of debt swaps, which are deals that kind of offer very limited debt relief, and only if those freed up funds are spent on specific initiatives like climate and conservation. And so what we highlight in the report is that the largest ever debt swap was finalized in Ecuador in 2023, and it earmarked funds for conservation in the Galapagos. But as our friends at Latin Dad have pointed out, it was a deal that lacked transparency and community input, and ultimately it funneled a lot of money to private financial advisors as well. And again, it canceled only a very tiny fraction of what Ecuador and other distressed countries owe. And what we also want to note is that the fanfare around this kind of false solution masks a much deeper issue, which is the reinforcing of a colonial dynamic where global North countries dictate how global South countries spend money that's rightfully theirs. So I think later we'll be hearing from other respondents. Oh,
sorry to interrupt you. The interpreters are asking for you to please slow down. And I know
Okay.
this is already
No
slow
problem.
for you, but slower, please. Thank you.
Perfect. I will try my best. Okay. So I think we'll just go on to the next chapter. Okay. All right. So turning to another issue that we see as being intimately linked with debt, that's the continued domination of the IMF and World Bank, or Bretton Woods Institutions, over global economic governance. So last year, they celebrated 80 years of existence, and that's obviously not something that we celebrate, which is why we've dedicated a chapter to this. And so in the report, we look at a few different things, but today I want to highlight one from the IMF, which is IMF surcharges. And so those are the financial penalties that are imposed on the most indebted countries that already, by literal definition, have the most crushing debt burdens. And so countries that are continuing to pay these surcharges include Pakistan and Egypt and Argentina, countries that are already experiencing the worst impacts of climate change or are in the midst of an economic crisis, basically. But in a positive turn, we want to highlight how persistent civil society campaigns have pressured the IMF into lowering their surcharges by 36% in October 2024. And so that means that there are fewer countries that will have to pay surcharges. That's 16 countries in 2026, which is down from 22 in 2024, but still double pre-pandemic figures. And of course, we want that number to be 0 countries, which has to be achieved by eliminating surcharges completely. As for the World Bank, I want to talk about how the bank has been prioritizing private investment, all while its rich donor countries have been consistently underfunding IDA, which is the World Bank financing arm that is the largest multilateral provider of grants and concessional finance for low-income countries. So World Bank President Ajay Banga has challenged donors to make a record-breaking $100 billion replenishment in this cycle, IDA 21. But as we see on the next slide, this takes place in a context where donor countries' contributions have actually stagnated in nominal terms, but in real terms actually declined by around 20% over the past decade. So a major concern here for civil society is the bank's private finance first development model. We're looking here at not just how much is pledged towards IDA, but who is receiving that funding. And in 2017, the bank launched the IDA private sector window. What we see this doing is eating into scarce public IDA resources and redirecting them to the International Finance Corporation, or IFC, and the Multilateral Investment Agency, which is the bank's private investment and political insurance arms, respectively. And so because of the private sector window, recent assessments have shown that IFC has become a net recipient of IDA resources rather than a contributor to it. And then despite receiving those billions of dollars in funding, IFC projects in low-income countries are performing worse than ever in terms of development impacts, and that's by the World Bank's own evaluations. Finally, on the next slide, In the report, we also focus on an Argentinian case study of how the IMF and the World Bank continue to champion austerity. So I'll keep it brief, but what's kind of important to know here is that both the bank and the fund have been applauding the election of radical free market capitalist and ultra-right-wing climate denier Javier Milei. So what exactly are they celebrating here? In their words, it's Milei's drive for fiscal consolidation, which has involved Milei dissolving the Environment Ministry, slashing funding to just gender-responsive services and policies, and making plans to privatize over 24 state-owned companies, among many other actions. So under our taxation chapter, we see that we're in the midst of an unprecedented opportunity to advance tax justice. So something positive to highlight here. So historically, we've seen corporate profits soar while corporate tax revenues remain stagnant. And again, this makes governments reliant on regressive consumption taxes that disproportionately burden lower income people and women in particular. Recognizing that problem, CSOs and Global South countries from Africa in particular have for a long time campaigned for a binding UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation, as I'm sure many of you know. And a breakthrough in 2023 kickstarted the negotiations for that convention. And we see that as a really incredible opportunity to advance a progressive, feminist, decolonial, and ecologically just kind of new global tax system. And what we want to see as well is a replacement of our fragmented system of tax treaties, which favor rich countries, with instead a coherent global system that recognizes that tax is a powerful tool, not just for progressive taxation to raise much needed revenues, but also to repair historical inequalities within and between countries. And on the next slide, we want to highlight some of the primary antagonists of the tax convention. And I'm sure it's very little surprise that all 8 countries that voted against the original terms of reference of the tax convention were wealthy OECD countries. And so what we have here is a map that shows how some of those countries have perpetuated tax injustice both globally and also domestically. So noting a few, the UK is responsible for almost a third of all corporate tax abuse that affects countries all around the world. The US owns 20% of all global offshore wealth through its citizens, and Israel has withheld billions in tax revenues from Palestine as a punitive measure. But despite that, we also see the fight for a UN tax convention continuing, and we have seen some really big wins, which includes clear commitments to address tax dodging, explicit links between tax and environmental protection, and references to human rights, all of which were driven by Global South governments and civil society, and really kind of pushing for the ambitiousness of the text. But gender was a starkly missing component, which makes it really important for future negotiations to amplify demands related to tax and gender justice. Okay, so in our last chapter, on the next, perfect. We look at climate finance, where the trends we see are broadly similar to what we covered in the last report. So under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Global North countries were obligated to provide $100 billion per year in climate finance by 2020. And they failed to reach that goal every single year. And in 2024, the OECD announced that that goal was finally met for the first time, but 2 years too late. And a closer look on the next slide shows a lot of business as usual, which is that less than a third of this was delivered in grant equivalent terms. So that's the kind of thing on the most right of the slide that shows that the vast majority of climate finance, well, what that means is that the vast majority has been delivered as loans, with Global North countries expecting either a return on investment to cover those loans or simply for the Global South to take on even more debt in the midst of a sovereign debt crisis. And something we highlight as well in the beginning of the report, of course, is the 92% of the overshoot of safe fair share of emissions having been caused by Global North countries. So really, we see this as nothing short of kind of robbery from the countries that are facing and will continue to face the worst impacts of the climate emergency. All right, so, I don't think I have a next slide on this, never mind. Making matters worse, we see that a lot of the climate finance projects that the Global North is investing in are either greenwashing or have genuinely no apparent climate mitigation or adaptation benefits. So a few of the examples we highlight in the report include Japan financing a new coal plant in Bangladesh, the US offering loans to Haiti for a hotel expansion, and the World Bank delivering loans in the Philippines that are contingent on neoliberal reforms, which include the full liberalization of its renewable energy sector. And as highlighted by, I think it was Ibon International, this has really exacerbated violence against women through resource plunder, labor exploitation, and militarization, among others. So just to go back quickly as well to that $100 billion climate finance goal, at COP29 last year, countries finally landed on an updated target. We didn't include this in the new report because it was after we had finalized the work. But it's worth emphasizing that the new goal of $300 billion per year by 2035 is a real pittance compared to the $2.4 trillion per year that the Global South needs for climate finance. And we see that all of this takes place in a context of continued underfunding of climate finance, including for all three of the multilateral funds, climate funds that serve the UNFCCC, which includes the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environment Facility, and the Green Climate Fund. I don't think I have a conclusion slide, but I'm just going to kind of wrap up quickly with a conclusion. All right, so kind of a quick recap of what we've seen under debt, kind of rising debt for the most climate vulnerable countries and the proliferation of false solutions to resolve that debt. In the IMF and World Bank, continued punitive measures by the IMF and the World Bank private finance first agenda that prioritizes profit over well-being, and grossly insufficient climate finance that has amounted to greenwashing in many cases or just being too returns-oriented in others. And as feminists, it's very important for us to be criticizing the unjust systems of extraction that we see throughout all of these themes, which, of course, is the work that I see being done every day. But we also emphasize opportunities to champion systems change and recognize that we see real progress in that fight. And that includes what we're seeing on the UN Tax Convention, but also a lot of the work on the ground by people's movements and rights defenders everywhere that are kind of working towards building economies of solidarity and reciprocity and radical abundance for people that for a very long time have labored under conditions of dispossession. And so it's been really, really brilliant to be collaborating with such amazing people on research pieces like these that give me a glimpse into that work, and I'm really proud to be part of it. And on that note, I'd like to pass it back to Katie, Shereen, Julia, and Naomi to hear from some very inspiring feminists. Thank you, Katie. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Arimbi. Really, really appreciate your work and your diligence and your ability to comb through all of this data and information and make it make sense and make it useful to the broader movement. So thank you so much. We are now going to turn to our respondents. We're first going to hear from Julia Gerlo from Fundación Ambiente y Recursos Naturales in Argentina, followed by Naomi Nyamweya from the Malala Fund, and finally Shereen Talaat from MENAFem movement. I know that Julia and Naomi have slides, so I'm going to stop sharing so that Julia can get her slides up. And yeah, looking forward to hearing from you, Julia. Thank you so much for being with us. I see your slides. I'm going to spotlight you, and yeah, over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Hola a todos y a todas, muchas gracias. La verdad que en primer lugar agradecerles, es un honor poder formar parte de este panel, de esta discusión y bueno, y haber trabajado con muchas de ustedes en este último tiempo. La verdad que es muy inspirador el trabajo, conocer el trabajo y todo lo que están haciendo desde diferentes partes del mundo. Así que, bueno, estuve pensando mucho en qué decir. Arambi hizo creo que una muy buena presentación de todo el informe y en esto ¿no? de pensar, de trabajar ya hace varios años en torno ¿no? A las instituciones de Bretton Woods, al Fondo Monetario Internacional y al FMI y al Banco Mundial, le estuve dando vueltas y pensando de algún modo cómo dar cuenta, ¿no? De algún modo cuando nosotros estamos desde sociedad civil reclamando con diferentes comunidades, con diferentes organizaciones, por una reforma, ¿no? Y ahí me pregunto si apuntamos a una reforma de algún modo dentro de los márgenes, ¿no? del sistema, o podemos pensar en reformas más radicales. Y en este sentido me parece muy importante mencionar algunos puntos que el informe, que el reporte ya presenta y ponerlos sobre la mesa, ¿no? Remarcarlos, porque cuando hablamos de que que el sistema financiero internacional no ha podido dar respuesta, ¿no? No está pudiendo dar respuestas a una triple crisis planetaria, una crisis climática sin precedentes, a una crisis de pobreza y una crisis de deuda que estamos enfrentando los países del sur global, que no podía dar respuesta, ¿no es cierto? Estamos diciendo de algún modo que necesitamos un cambio. Y cuando hablamos de un cambio, lo que seguimos viendo, ¿no? A 2024 y el reporte, con muchos de los datos que presenta el reporte, es que los países del sur global tenemos una representación muy pobre en los espacios de toma de decisión del banco y del fondo, ¿no? Que nuestras voces siempre están sobre representadas y que nuestros países tienen poca chance, ¿no? de poder tomar decisiones. En este caso, por ejemplo, en el caso del Fondo Monetario Internacional, solo Estados Unidos cuenta con un 16% del poder del total de los votos y tiene poder de veto, ¿no? Supera ampliamente este número a países como India, Brasil y Sudáfrica en conjunto, ¿no? Entonces ya partimos de que hay una desigualdad muy notable, ¿no? En estas instituciones en cuanto a lo que podemos decir y lo que no podemos decir los países del sur global. En segundo lugar, hay una falta de transparencia en torno a todas las transacciones y a los préstamos que se generan, que genera, por ejemplo, el Banco Mundial. En el caso del Banco Mundial, hablando sí ya respecto al financiamiento climático y al financiamiento en materia ambiental, este año 41 billones de dólares, 41.000 millones de dólares destinados al financiamiento climático, ¿no? Un financiamiento que los países del sur global necesitan cada vez más para hacer frente para invertir en políticas de adaptación y mitigación contra el cambio climático. Vemos que estos fondos, por ejemplo, casi el 40% de estos fondos no se sabe bien, ¿no? No se saben bien a dónde fueron destinados, ¿no? No tienen un recording, no tienen, ¿no? No tienen una contability, ¿no? de dónde estos fondos. Y por otro lado, continuamos, como ya mencionó Arambi anteriormente, con un opaco, ¿no? En cuanto a los fondos climáticos y ambientales. Vemos que, por ejemplo, el Banco Mundial continúa de algún modo a través de su brazo privado, del IFC, invirtiendo, por ejemplo, en fósiles. En el caso de Argentina, que es un caso que trabajamos muy de cerca con comunidades en Vaca Muerta, podemos ver que el IFC sigue involucrado, ¿no? En un shareholdings financiando proyectos, un proyecto fósil en nuestro país, a la vez que, por otro lado, está haciendo, ¿no? Está enmascarándose, ¿no? De llevar adelante ciertas políticas climáticas en línea con el Acuerdo de París y todo el nuevo framework que lanzó el banco. Entonces, lo que me interesa recalcar por el poco tiempo que tengo, voy a pasar a esta diapositiva, ¿no? Es que siempre a la hora, ¿no? de trabajar tanto género como la cuestión ambiental, el banco como el Fondo Monetario Internacional tiene un approach, un enfoque instrumentalista y compartimentalizado, porque si por un lado impulsan de algún modo diferentes políticas en cuanto a género, políticas en cuanto a ambiente, entre comillas lo digo, por otro lado se dan vuelta, ¿no? Del otro lado del escritorio y continúan, por ejemplo, invirtiendo en fósiles, continúan empujando a los países del sur global a la austeridad, ¿no? Y sabemos que, por ejemplo, que medidas, ¿no? O sea, promover la austeridad en los países del sur global tienen un impacto directo y un impacto completamente desproporcionado sobre mujeres, sobre niñas y sobre las diversidades. Y acá, como mencionó Arambi en el informe, hay un recuadro específicamente sobre la situación de mi país, de Argentina, en donde las medidas, ¿no? establecidas bajo el acuerdo, ¿no? Bajo uno de los acuerdos que tiene Argentina con el fondo, ya que es el principal deudor con esta institución. Una de las principales medidas, ¿no? Y el festejo, ¿no? que tienen estas instituciones con un gobierno de ultraderecha, con un gobierno que persigue minorías, ¿no? que estigmatiza a las comunidades indígenas, que estigmatiza a mujeres, al colectivo LGTQI y demás. En este contexto, el FMI continúa apoyando al gobierno, continúa, ¿no? renegociando un nuevo acuerdo y a su vez festeja de algún modo los ajustes. Estos ajustes, por ejemplo, desembocaron en el cierre, ¿no? en el cierre del Ministerio de Mujeres y Diversidades, en el cierre de muchas de las políticas públicas destinadas a mujeres, niñas y adolescentes, y en una baja, ¿no? de categoría, en una baja de categoría del Ministerio de Ambiente. Y en este momento, con esto ya cierro porque estoy mirando el tiempo, en este momento en Argentina más de 20.000 hectáreas en la Patagonia están en llamas, ¿no? Y cuando hablamos de crisis planetaria hablamos de esto, ¿no? Estamos hablando de incendios cada vez más frecuentes, incendios cada vez más recurrentes, y frente a esto no solo necesitamos medidas de prevención, sino también necesitamos fondos, ¿no? Necesitamos dinero para poder hacer frente a estas diferentes catástrofes, y lo que está pasando, por ejemplo, es que con el cierre del Ministerio de Ambiente, uno de los programas que se financió fue las partidas del manejo del fuego. En este caso podemos ver, ¿no? cómo justamente la austeridad fiscal tiene un impacto directo, ¿no? Me gusta traer de algún modo este ejemplo porque es muy gráfico, ¿no? Porque cuando hablamos de austeridad fiscal, cuando hablamos de que tiene un impacto en derechos humanos, en impacto en las mujeres, muchas veces por ahí puede sonar un poco abstracto, ¿no? Pero son casos concretos, ¿no? Que el de financiamiento genera consecuencias tremendas en el ambiente, genera consecuencias tremendas en aquellos grupos más marginalizados, en aquellos grupos más desventajados. Entonces, me parece que cuando pedimos de algún modo por la reforma desde la sociedad civil y con grupos feministas y con diferentes colegas que nos encontramos años tras años, cuando estamos pidiendo reformas en la arquitectura financiera internacional, es justamente porque estamos hablando de que en 80 años de su creación no han podido romper con décadas de estancamiento y no han podido dar de algún modo respuesta a la crisis planetaria, a la triple crisis que estamos atravesando. Y un primer paso, me parece, de algún modo, un primer paso para pensar esta reforma que siempre desde la Fundación Ambiente y Recursos Naturales venimos empujando, es el reconocimiento de algún modo de las deudas, de la deuda ecológica, ¿no? que tienen los países del norte global con el sur global. Entonces, ese me parece que es un primer punto para la conversación, porque si no, seguir planteando nuevas políticas, ¿no? como el RST, falsas soluciones, ¿no? como los mercados de carbono que muchas veces estas instituciones pregonan, no dan respuesta, ¿no? a los problemas y no permiten de algún modo, ¿no? que nuestros países avancen hacia una transición socioecológica justa. Entonces, me parece que un primer paso para poder seguir conversando, ¿no? acerca de la reforma del sistema financiero internacional y acerca de qué reformas necesitan el Grupo Banco Mundial y el FMI, es el reconocimiento de esta deuda. Y como dije, bueno, hay muchas trabas, ¿no? Mucha resiliencia, muchos intereses, ¿no? a la hora de poder tener estas conversaciones. Entonces, la verdad que celebro estos espacios, estos encuentros para poder seguir pensando, para poder seguir presionando, y bueno, y quedo a disposición por cualquier otra duda. Fui medio rápido y en algún momento espero no haber sido desordenada, pero no quería ser repetitiva, y bueno, cualquier duda o cualquier otra información, ¿no? relacionada específicamente a las políticas, por ejemplo, del RST o políticas más específicas del fondo del banco, las podemos ir conversando en la segunda etapa. Así que bueno, muchas gracias y paro acá.
Thank you so much, Julia. Really, really appreciate you being here with us today, especially while you're not even technically working. We've learned so much from you and from your analysis, and we were really, really grateful to collaborate with you and other colleagues from FARN on the trends report to strengthen that Argentina analysis and the IMF World Bank analysis in particular. And I think, as you were saying, it's exactly what we're hoping to accomplish with these spaces, is to create opportunities to really learn from national and regionally specific cases of Trump is doing many of the things that Malay already did, and so we need to learn from each other how to resist and how to counter that, and how to not also, as you were saying, get discouraged or so discouraged in the face of these shifts that we lose our energy to continue working together. So I think that was super important, and thank you so much. And there will definitely be an opportunity for people to ask you questions and engage in the discussion after the other two respondents. So thank you again, and thank you also to our interpreters. We're now going to turn to Naomi Nyamweya from the Malala Fund. Naomi works on their economic justice programming and has an exciting new initiative that's very much in line with the 7 key demands of the Action Nexus, as well as an interesting complement to what we've presented so far. So Naomi, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katie. Thank you to WEDO for organizing this and also for the Economic Trends Report, which is very useful for all of us in this space. My name is Naomi Nyamweya. I am a policy manager at Malala Fund. My focus is on education, financing, and economics, and that has grown into a more economic justice angle for us and our work, moving away from focusing on aid and ODA, which isn't really helpful. So I have a quick presentation to make, starting with something that we all know, feel like I'm preaching to the choir. Debt is not just an economic issue, it is a feminist issue. And this is because debt dictates who gets educated, it dictates who gets healthcare, it dictates who eats and who is sacrificed in the name of fiscal or financial discipline. And when governments prioritize debt repayments over public services, the first casualties are always women and girls. So let's look at some numbers that are relevant to our work on debt and girls' education. Currently, there are 122 million girls out of school. And this is not because we lack solutions or because we lack money. It is because we are prioritizing creditors and their profits over the lives of children. According to the UN, there are nearly 40% of developing countries, 52 in number, that are grappling with severe debt problems. In 2024, an average of 42% of national budgets in low and lower middle income countries went to servicing debt, with 16 countries in total dedicating more than 5 times their education budgets to repaying creditors. So this isn't just an education crisis or a crisis of education, it is a crisis of priorities. Atiya Waris, who is the UN independent expert on foreign debt, has created this framework, which I think is really interesting and also just explains the issue so clearly. And here she shows how the cycles of debt mirror the life of a girl, shaping her future before she even has a chance to choose. So in a girl's early years, the government borrows in the name of public investments. And what we tend to see in low and lower middle income countries is that this investment is in building roads, in these like huge mega projects, and not really in public investments. But even when these countries borrow, the repayments of these debts take priority over funding for healthcare, over funding for education, over funding for nutrition. And so an infant girl suffers first. She has less food, she has fewer vaccinations, and she faces higher mortality rates. Then as she grows older and she goes into her school years, debt repayments begin to kick in, which means that education budgets are further shrinking. So classrooms become overcrowded, teachers are stretched too thin, and the hidden costs for schooling rise. And when families have to choose who gets educated, then girls are pulled out first, which then forces them into domestic care work and into caregiving. Then when a girl now arrives at adolescence, we see these economic conditions collide with the patriarchy, and it further disadvantages her. So we see scenarios where child marriage becomes an economic survival strategy. We see that the girls who stay in school face period poverty, they are in unsafe classrooms, and they have worsening education quality. Then when this girl becomes a young adult, she encounters a job market with shrinking job opportunities because governments are not really investing in the economy to create jobs, which is pushing her into low-wage work and pushing her into insecure work. Meanwhile, there's no provisions for childcare. The healthcare system is failing, which then forces the woman to shoulder more, to absorb the shock of more unpaid care work, and whatever work she's doing is being taxed so heavily in order to repay debts. So she's working hard to repay debts. Her taxes are not being used to fill in the gaps in public services. And so it's just, she's just burdened by the patriarchy, debt, the economic conditions. And when this girl is now a mature adult, the government then borrows again to service the old loans, which repeats the same crisis. So mothers who grew up under austerity struggle to provide for children, facing the same underfunded schools that she faced, the same poorly resourced hospitals that she had, that are going to come into a country, into a world with more and more shrinking opportunities. And so this is the reality. Sorry. And so this is the reality of debt. It doesn't just burden economies, it actually steals girls' futures. And so when we are talking about debt and girls' education, then we're thinking about how debt starves the education system. So there's this global community enshrined with, there's this global commitment, enshrined within the SDGs to achieve universal education for all girls and boys by 2030. But we know that 122 million girls remain out of school. 88 million of these girls are adolescents in lower income countries. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it is startling to note that the number of out-of-school girls is actually rising, not declining. And yet, since 2015, the global share of budgets that's spent on education has actually fallen. And lower income countries, especially those facing the largest girls' education challenges, urgently need to invest into their education systems in order to accommodate the rapidly expanding youth populations and in order to reach the most marginalized girls who are more expensive to get into school. And contributing to this challenge is the debt crisis, which is also disproportionately affecting these lower income countries that are facing the worst girls' education challenges. And when countries are responding to these difficulties, often in response to IMF bailout preconditions, as we have had earlier, they retrench their public spending. One of the most common IMF prescriptions is fiscal consolidation, which is austerity by another name. And in practice, it entails cutting to public services. It entails increases in regressive taxation, such as value-added tax. It entails wage bill caps, which means that we are not training more teachers, we are not paying them fairly, we are not motivating them, and it also leads to pension reforms. So this harms girls directly and indirectly. It harms them directly because they are losing the gender-responsive services that they need. We don't have gender-responsive education, but we don't have access to SRHR, we don't have access to WASH. So we are disadvantaging girls in that way. For example, last year in Kenya, which is the country that I'm from, because we got a bailout from the IMF, there was a cut to school feeding programs, which harms the poorest families the most. And indirectly, it is impoverishing families further. So when you're thinking about girls and their education, the biggest indicator of whether a girl is going to stay in school, whether she's going to learn, and whether she's going to complete 12 years of schooling is her family's economic standing. And when we are increasing value-added tax, when we have regressive taxation, when we're doing fiscal consolidation, we're making families poorer, which means that the demand for schooling as well as the supply for schooling is falling. And globally, we know that 20% of girls from the poorest families complete schooling compared to 90% of girls from the richest families. So that doesn't only worsen inequalities among countries between like the global south and the global north, but then it also worsens inequalities within countries. I have a very short case study, which is drawing from the earlier example that was made with Zambia and the common framework. So Zambia made secondary schooling free, which was widely considered a major victory for civil society within the country. But without investments in infrastructure, the result has been 160 students per class. So that's 160 students to one teacher. There are no desks, there are no textbooks, there is no individual attention to learners, and there is actually declining literacy rates and worsening education quality in Zambia, even with the free schooling. So the fact is that this isn't unique to Zambia. It's the same across Africa. It's the same across countries in the global south. Debt is squeezing budgets and leading to underfunded education, which makes this promise of free public schooling for 12 years for all learners a very fragile promise. Every dollar that is sent to creditors is a dollar that is stolen from investments into a girl's future. Instead of funding schools, the governments are spending billions to creditors. Instead of training teachers, governments are struggling to pay wages. Instead of giving school meals, girls and boys are left hungry. Girls are forced to shoulder care work. They are married off in order to survive. And so we see that debt isn't just this financial burden, it's also reinforcing gendered cycles of poverty. And so when we talk about feminist approaches to debt, when we talk about girls' education, we can't talk about it without talking about debt justice. Research shows that if debt payments were cut to just 5% of government revenues, 5 million more children could go to school annually. And so a feminist approach to debt, as we have seen in the Trends report, means reforming global debt structures to prioritize human rights over creditors' profits. It means ensuring that we are considering the impact of debt on gender equality and that we have gender impact assessments when we are talking about restructuring debt. And it means that we are shifting power in global financial institutions so that debtor nations and the girls within these debtor nations also have a voice. And lastly, I will draw from a really powerful report that ActionAid just put out. It's called Who Owes Who? And the point that they're trying to make is that rich countries created this global debt crisis, whereas developing countries and their girls are paying the price. So the conversation needs to shift from who must repay to who must repair. We need to talk about reparations instead of loans. That should be the focus. And wealthy nations, as Julia mentioned, must recognize their colonial and their climate debts, which far exceed the debts of the global south. So according to ActionAid in their new report, rich polluting countries owe $107 trillion in climate debt, which is 70 times greater than the $1.45 trillion that global south countries owe total in debt. So the global education crisis and all feminist issues are solvable, but only if we stop treating debt repayment as sacred while we're treating girls' futures as negotiable. And as we know, preaching to the choir, this is not just a policy issue, it is actually a moral imperative. I will stop there.
Wow, thank you so much, Naomi. That was incredibly clear and a really important reminder that we aren't just talking about policy issues. As you were saying, we're talking about actually people's lives, especially girls' lives, women's lives, lives of gender diverse people and other people facing discrimination. Really appreciate you sharing that. And I find it really interesting, actually, that you and Julia both kind of arrived at the same concluding point without knowing that both of your presentations were going to end there. And I think it does speak to the need for our own efforts at shifting the narrative and shifting the understanding of the depth of the sort of hegemonic understanding of how the economy functions and should function is actually, overturnable. Like we are able to conceptualize of how the economy functions in different ways that are more just, that do speak to the need for reparations and reversing colonial and climate debt. So thank you so much for that. For our final respondent, before we open it up for discussion, I'm going to turn to my colleague Shereen Talaat from the MENAFem movement. So Shereen, thank you so much for being here, and over to you.
Thanks a lot, Katie, and thanks a lot for Julia, Naomi, for the presentations, for shedding the lights on the important topics also that the report is covering. And I want here also to speak about the finance and development. And as you mentioned, Katie, now as we're speaking, the third RIPCOM is happening in New York, and the civil society has already submitted its response around the zero draft. The zero draft that included different topics like debt, tax, private finance, shed some lights on governance. But while the finance and development is a very important opportunity, we have a very important opportunity that actually, I may say, will provide a unique opportunity to reform the financing on many levels. One of the most important thing is including support the reform of the international financial architecture. And on that, I want to shed some lights around our feminist perspective on the finance and development, but also in the context of the MENA region. One fact I want to put on the table, and actually it was said in a different way by my colleagues, that this financing system is already broken. And it is already failing us. And I believe that the 4th International Conference of Financing for Development can be a turning point. And feminists from the Global South movement and the global movement have long exposed how debt, tax, injustice, and the international financial architecture fuel inequalities and the climate crisis. The solution on the table is to shift the power and to not only to restructure, but to dismantle the structural inequalities and to ensure economic and climate justice. You may all know how debt actually impacting all kinds of other aspects of development, specifically that is related on gender and climate. So debt justice as a climate and gender justice imperative is a framework that we have to work around. Debt in the MENA region, for example, has skyrocketed in 2023. Public debt exceeded 90% of GDP in countries like Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia. Egypt spends around 54% of its total revenue on debt servicing, only on debt servicing, more than double of its spending on health, education, etc. Tunisia external debt reached 80% of GDP, forcing طبعا austerity measures that harm يعني the most harm يعني people in the community that is facing the harm of the austerity measures are women and marginalized group in the intersectionality of gender also. The IMF sorry charge policy, and that is very important. I mean, my colleague Naomi was mentioning building schools, versus paying debt services. It's actually, we are paying also debt penalties. They are punishing us as countries that most in need countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and Jordan from the region, from the MENA region, but also Argentina and other countries around Latin or Africa, paying surcharges. Although we as civil society managed to have, as we call, a small victory in surcharges, to reform surcharges by 36%, but that's not enough. Still, if Jordan wasn't paying surcharges, for example, till this moment, even after the reform, they could actually save their educational system, at least building 200 schools, rather than paying surcharges. This surcharge that Tunisia is paying actually can save the health sector in Tunisia, the public health sector, of course. So IMF surcharge policy that already mentioned in the report and the austerity program have deepened the inequalities. And our feminist movement, as I mentioned, fought for eliminating surcharges, but also debt cancellation and debt restructuring, where we are, through the FFD4, are pushing forward to and hoping to that the FFD4 deliver a binding solution, not just voluntary measures. The Bretton Woods Institutions, and as already Julia put on the table, but many countries remain dependent on the IMF and World Bank loans. There is countries in the region and in Africa that has the IMF there for more than a decade or two. And having the IMF as a last resort and keep having like from 15 to 20 different or following programs of the IMF means that those programs already is failing our economy. So the bank and the fund are now embedded in our lives in the MENA region. In Egypt alone, Masalan has taken around 58 billion IMF loans since 2016. Of course, that is fueling inflation and structural adjustment that have worsened the poverty. Women in MENA are more affected and impacted by IMF imposed austerity. Public sector employment, where 86% of women workers are concentrated, has been cut due to the IMF programs. The Bretton Woods system is actually as part of this global economic system, but given the fact that they are key players, are actually failing people. And the reform here is essential, especially on governance. If we don't have an equal voice within this circle of reform, that means it will continue failing. And that doesn't mean only by adding a fourth or fifth voice for Africa. That is not the answer. If we have an equal and democratic system, governance system for the bank and the fund, a lot of things will be solved, like surcharge, SDRs, etc. Going to the tax and tax justice to fund just transition. MENA loses over 60 billion annually due to tax evasions and illicit financial flows. That is more than double the total annual spending on social protection in the region. In Egypt, the corporate tax rate was reduced from 40% in 1990 to 22.5% now. طبعا benefiting large corporates, while the government increased regressive VAT tax that hurt the poor, only the poor. The feminist economic justice framework demand global tax reform, and including wealth taxes, including financial transaction taxes, and measuring to corporate tax dodging, etc. And thanks also to the African group, now we're having a UN-led global tax body that needs to consider gender in its framework. On climate finance must be public and reparative and justice centered. In MENA, and we have to say, MENA countries are all climate vulnerable regions, and we are facing more and more through the years more ecological crisis. By the way, I have to say that, like yesterday, we didn't sleep because we have another earthquake in Morocco, and apparently that will be our new reality. How actually the world will respond to this ecological crisis after ecological crisis, not only in the MENA region but around the global south. Pakistan's floods. We had also in the MENA region floods in Libya last year, in Morocco, a big disaster, earthquake, etc., etc. And the problem that only 2% of the global adaptation finance reaches the MENA region, despite record of heat waves and droughts of water, shortage that affects millions of people. And we see that the FFD4 must call for a new global financing pact that guarantees fair climate finance based on historical responsibility, of course. And going back to that, and I want to share some of what the feminist group within the, oh my God, you only see my my eyes. I'm sorry. I want to share some of what the feminists contributed on the third draft. The main topics was actually a human rights across all economic areas of life, as affirmed in many international agreements. And that was what was mentioned by the feminist group on the zero draft. Also recognizing and redistributing and reduce unpaid care and domestic work by giving primacy of public social protection services. Debt cancellation to enable developing countries to provide basic public services and tackle climate crisis. Transform the global financial system to prioritize people and planet. Establishing a mechanism for fulfillment of ODA, debt by the global north to the global south. This framework, debt framework, need to be democratic, transparent, and just. Definitely reparations to address the historical injustice of colonialization that led the foundation for the current economic and ecological crisis. That being said, and putting on the table that the FFD4 is an opportunity, the problem is, even inside the negotiations of the FFD4, we as feminists and civil society are facing a lot of problems, which give us put a big question on the table. What is this system doing, and where this system is moving forward? I mean, our colleagues who are in New York, and Katie, we're there, can tell more about how there is some pushing to not allow the civil society inside the negotiations. What kind of UN framework that we are looking for now? And given the fact what is happening in the USA, only one government that is controlling this UN system and this system, and not only the UN system, the multilateral system, including the Bretton Woods institutions, shaking the system with different decisions, maybe benefit their own countries or not. We don't know. This is going back to our American citizens, but colleagues, I mean, but given the fact that this system is shaking because of what is happening in the USA, that means that the system has already failed.
Can I ask you to wrap up, Shereen?
I will,
Yeah,
I'll wrap up. I'm sorry. Having now countries like Switzerland and Belgium, and correct me if I'm wrong, cutting their funding to the UN to prioritize military and security spending, it's a disaster for the multilateral system. That make us as feminists now think, what is our alternatives? What is this system going forward to do? Or is it the end of this system or not? Maybe that is questions that we need to answer all. Thanks a lot, Katie. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Shereen. Really appreciate, as always, your analysis and sharing with us a little bit of what's happening in the MENA region, where we see so many of the challenges with IMF loans, with the climate crisis only amplifies. And I think the question that you posed to us at the end is really a good one to start off our collective discussion. What is our role as feminists intervening in a multilateral system that not only has continually failed movements for justice in Palestine and Sudan and in the Congo and many other places, but is also now being disemboweled from within by the actions of the governments who are now refusing to fund it. So I'd really like to open the floor. I see we had a hand already from Grace, and others, if you have questions for Arimbi on the report or want to react or ask a question of anything that the respondents shared, now is your chance to do so. So the floor is open. Maybe Grace, I can come to you first. And Penina, if you wouldn't mind interpreting for Grace.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Katie, for the opportunity. And I want to also really thank the interpreters, because this work is not really easy. The discussions we are having are quite sensitive, quite heavy ones, even for me, but it's amazing. Maybe Grace. I'm Grace. That's my sign name, Grace. I'm a deaf person from Kenya, based in Kenya. Happy to join this conversation and contribute to these 4 thematic areas that we are discussing today in this report. My first question, my first concern. The question is directed to Naomi, who presented, especially on girls' education, on the effect of the debt on girls' education. From this research, maybe that you conducted, from the analysis that you did, I realized that you have a very good analysis but maybe where do we as girls with disabilities fall from your analysis? What is the impact of this on now even girls with disabilities? Because you realize that for girls with disabilities, then even they're still even more lagging behind on matters education. Grace video is hanging. Because when we talk about girls' education, Naomi, imagine parents of girls with disabilities will opt to lead their children without disabilities first to school and deprioritize the girls with disabilities. Because that is the practice actually under normal circumstances. Which is actually a challenge that I would want to throw back. To what extent has that data been able to highlight on the impact of this on girls with disabilities? Secondly, again, Naomi, maybe a question from your findings. Maybe what approach? Question. Sorry, Grace. Question two. Still to Naomi. The feminist approach. The feminist approach. The feminist approach to to investing, the feminist approach to investing in girls. This one for me maybe is not clear because again for me I've felt we as the minorities, women with disabilities again, or girls with disabilities, we've again felt in it again, we've not clearly had clear strategies that would now again ensure other minority girls or minority women, like women with disabilities, are brought into the mainstream using that approach. But maybe if clarity would be gotten about that, would be best. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace. Really appreciate your questions and contributing to this discussion. And thank you so much, Penina, for interpreting. Naomi had to step away because she wasn't feeling well, but I wrote down your questions and I will connect you with her over email so that she can answer you directly. And maybe if any of our other speakers, after we take a few more questions, want to respond to Grace's questions, that would be wonderful as well. Thank you. We also have a question in the chat from Faith on the role of private philanthropy in terms of helping to advance the interconnected demands and analysis that's been shared here. So I don't know if anyone wants to take that one. And maybe we can take one more if anyone wants to add to the discussion before we go back to it.
It's okay. Thanks for that consideration.
Thanks, Penina. Thanks, Grace. Feel free to come in. You can raise your hand. Don't be shy.
Do you want me to answer the question of Faith?
Sure.
Well,
thanks, Shereen. Go ahead.
Well, the philanthropists and the philanthropic system actually have an opportunity to, first of all, to mobilize funding for the feminists' efforts from a local level, sorry, from the local to global level. And I know, for example, the Green Global Fund and Gaga and others, and I'm part of this initiative that is still still a baby initiative to be able to mobilize funding from the global north to the global south around climate finance. Maybe supporting those kind of initiatives is needed now, is more than ever needed. I mean, especially after what is happening in the world. And it is not only GGF, but also other philanthropists. I guess they need more to shift the focus on supporting the especially the feminist groups from the local to global, but also understanding that needs a lot of effort in mobilizing money from the government, from the northern governments. And those are not only the it's not about the money of taxpayers, it's money of reparation of climate. And that needs to be done now more than ever. The MENA region, for example, one of the regions are going to face famine in the upcoming 2 years because of the global warming and climate change. So I hope that I answered you. Thank you.
Thanks, Shereen. I think that's a really interesting reflection. And there's a related question in the chat, which we'll come to as well. But somebody was saying yesterday in a side event to the FFD negotiations that getting philanthropy to even fund work on issues, for example, of tax justice is a little bit of a challenge, since philanthropy is in of itself a tax dodging vehicle. So I thought that was pretty funny, but also speaks to some of the challenges that we face as structural feminists in terms of really pushing for the kind of change that is required to make things fundamentally different. So related to the question that Godeliev, sorry if I've mispronounced your name, put in the chat, whether the report indicates structural alternatives to the current financing modalities. Maybe Arimbi, maybe you can explain a little bit of what the report is and is not, because we didn't go over that this time. And then Julia, if you want to answer the second part, maybe on can we really move to something fundamentally new? So Arimbi, please go ahead.
Thanks, Katie. So first of all, something you note in your question is that the diagnoses in the report are not something new. And I think that's something that we really want to recognize as well. It's like a lot of these trends have been continuing on for decades and decades, and that's part of why we're doing this report, is to kind of capture how, despite so much campaigning, we're still seeing a lot of business as usual. So that's the kind of first part of the trends report, is recognizing that there's not enough progress on these issues. But second of all, you call out the fact of structural alternatives. And so I think I kind of have a two-part answer to this. First is that, yes, I think we do explore structural alternatives in terms of things like the UN Tax Convention, where we see progress on those efforts. And then in other moments, we kind of call out what feminists want to see in terms of systems change as measured according to our key demands, or the Feminist Action Nexus key demands. And so that's things like the UN multilateral sovereign debt workout mechanism. But in terms of really replacing the current financing modalities, and maybe this is something we can explore in the next trends report as well, Katie, something to think about, is I think we do kind of talk about how, things like we want to see more representation in the IMF, but then maybe at the same time, we also have to shift the narrative a bit to why talk about more representation at the IMF when we don't like the IMF? And other things like, Shereen, as you rightly pointed out, the fact that the collapse of USAID is something that can so horrendously impact humanitarian aid budgets around the world is just ridiculous. The fact that Trump is able to kind of single-handedly bring down so much of that work, it shows how aid is a band-aid over a very, very broken system. And so in the report last year, we talked about how, we're not seeing enough development finance and climate finance, really important things, true. Like, we cannot understate how important those things are, but at the same time, it is a band-aid over a broken system. And, why why demand something that's framed as aid when we could frame it in terms of reparations and money that's, you know, as feminists have been saying, very, very rightfully the right of people of marginalized groups and global South countries the world over that have suffered for so long under tax abuse and illicit financial flows and unjust punishing systems of debt. You know, even recognizing that when you talk about debt, many countries will respond that, you know, oh, but these countries willingly took on that debt, without recognizing that the systems in place right now are severely punishing countries for debt that, in many cases, was obtained in unjust ways, etc. Anyways, that was kind of a really long-winded answer to say that, yes, I think in some places we identify structural alternatives, and though the trends report is not necessarily exploring solutions, maybe something that we can work on in the next report is also looking at, you know, where do we see things as a bit of a step towards something better, but then also wanting to really kind of change the system.
Lovely. Thanks, Arimbi. Julia, over to you.
Bueno, gracias. Ahí voy a complementar un poco lo que comentó Arambi, y me parece en primer lugar que en muchos espacios la primera demanda siempre que nos hacen, bueno, ¿y qué solución tienen? ¿Y ustedes qué proponen, no? Creo que las soluciones, entre comillas soluciones, una y otra vez, ¿no? O sea, siempre sobre la mesa está, en primer lugar, la reparación y, como mencioné, de algún modo, el reconocimiento de la deuda ecológica por parte de los países del norte global hacia el sur global. Entonces, ahí podríamos realmente empezar una conversación, porque me parece que en múltiples instancias, desde las reuniones del Banco Mundial, desde los diferentes foros como el Finance for Development, en su momento sobre la cumbre de París en el año 2022 y en 23, y podemos seguir la iniciativa Bridge constantemente. Creo que hay un bloqueo sistemático, ¿no? Me parece de aquellos países desarrollados a la hora de poder sentarse a conversar en igualdad de condiciones. Entonces me parece que cualquier respuesta, antes de dar cualquier respuesta, deberíamos ir un paso por detrás. No creo que no creo que no es el movimiento feminista la que tiene que dar respuestas necesariamente, porque no somos justamente nosotros los que llegamos a esta situación, pero sí me parece clave que cualquier conversación que se dé tiene que partir de algún modo de poder sentarse, ¿no? en los países en igualdad de condiciones. Y en segundo lugar, con una de las preguntas que reflexioné o con las que abrí mi presentación fue justamente si podemos pensar reformas dentro de los márgenes propuestos o reformas más radicales. Justamente me parece que tiene que ser una construcción colectiva, y que a su vez muchas de las respuestas o muchas de las soluciones dentro de los márgenes del sistema, ya estamos hablando, ¿no? de la reforma de cuota del FMI, como dijo Shereen, de la eliminación de los sobrecargos a los países del sur global, pero lo que estamos viendo constantemente en todas las instancias de debate es de algún modo un bloqueo o de algún modo un bloqueo sistemático, ¿no? De algún modo de discutir sobre estos temas. Podemos hablar de alivios de deuda, de emisión de nuevos DEX, de, como mencioné, eliminación de sobrecargos dentro de los márgenes, por ejemplo, de la reforma del FMI. Pero si constantemente, hasta que me parece, hasta que no sea, hasta que no pensemos o no apuntemos hacia una gobernanza más democrática en términos globales, claramente no vamos a poder avanzar en ese sentido. O sea, entiendo que, no sé si respondí la pregunta en su totalidad, pero me parece que son algunas de las aristas para poder empezar a pensar este gran tema. Así que bueno, gracias.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Julia. I think that's we're at time, but I think that's an important point actually to end the discussion on, really thinking about how we as feminists contribute our analysis to new narratives, to new ways of thinking, while also pushing for the rightful responsibility of those who created the crisis, and thinking about how we can democratize and transform those institutions. So maybe to wrap up, I'll share a couple things that are coming next from among this kind of consortium, loose consortium of partners. Shereen and I and our colleagues are planning a global feminist convening in Rabat, Morocco in mid-May, looking at financing for development, looking at the climate agenda for the year, and really seeing how we can engage in some really collective and deep strategizing together. So we've sent out a save the date for that, but more information is coming soon, including there will be a little bit of funding to cover participation for a few global majority feminists, so opportunities to apply for that. And then I'm also doing some thinking with my colleague Tara Daniel, who's our climate finance expert, about how we kind of bring together the calls around climate finance and the Baku to Belen roadmap and the sort of what's happening in terms of the climate negotiations with FFD, and really thinking about financing for development in the context of some super technical stuff that Tara knows about in terms of Article 2.1c and aligning the Paris Agreement's commitment to align financial flows with climate action. So hopefully that will be another kind of contribution that we can then, collectively discuss and build from. But we're really, kind of always looking for spaces to connect, to share, to decentralize the thought leadership, to learn from global majority people's movements, feminist groups, from their analysis and resistance. So we hope that today has been a little bit of a snapshot of that. And we're really, really grateful to all of you for being here, to Arimbi for all of your work on the report and for your presentation, to Shereen, Julia, and Naomi for responding and sharing some, details and analysis from your own work. And to all of you for being part of the discussion. Thank you once again to our interpreters, Elsa, Rana, Simone, Chloe, Penina, Flavia, and Idal. And thank you so much, all of you once again. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll look forward to seeing you in person or in Zoom as we continue to struggle together for justice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.